The air in Natchez hung thick with honeysuckle and rot, the kind of sweetness that masked decay. Margaret Hale Wainwright stood at the second-floor window of Hawthorn Manor, her fingers pressed against the cool glass, watching the fields stretch endlessly toward the Mississippi River. The cotton was white as bone beneath the September sun, and the figures moving through it were dark and bent, their songs rising faintly on the wind. She had once found those songs beautiful, haunting even. Now they sounded like accusations. Behind her, the bedroom door opened without a knock. She didn't turn. She knew his footsteps the way she knew her own heartbeat. Heavy, assured, the stride of a man who believed the world bent to his will. Margaret. Colonel James Wainwright's voice carried the honeyed drawl of old Mississippi money. "You've been standing there all morning. The ladies are arriving at noon for tea. You should rest." "Should I?" Her voice was soft, almost dreamy. She tilted her head, watching a woman in the fields pause to wipe her brow. Even from this distance, Margaret could see the swell of her belly. "Tell me, James, how many are there?" Silence. Then, "How many what?" She turned slowly, her emerald silk dress whispering against the hardwood. Margaret was 32, with pale skin that had never known labor and auburn hair arranged in perfect ringlets. "Tell me in the comments which country you are from and what you thought of this story. And if this story made an impression on you, subscribe to the channel so you don't miss any future stories." Her beauty had been painted, praised, and poeticized throughout 3 counties. But her eyes were the color of winter sky and just as cold. "Children," she said simply, "how many of your children work our fields?" James Wainwright had faced Confederate militias, negotiated with governors, and once shot a man dead in a duel over a card game, but his wife's gaze made something in his chest constrict. He was 45, broad-shouldered, with silver threading through his dark hair and a face that women still called handsome. Right now, that face had gone carefully blank. "That's an inappropriate question." "Is it?" Margaret moved toward her vanity, her movements liquid and unhurried. She sat, began removing her earrings one by one. "I've been counting, you see. Sarah in the kitchen house, her boy Joshua has your nose. Delilah, who tends the roses, her daughter Lily has your eyes, that particular shade of grey-blue. And now Ruth, barely 18, carrying what will surely be another." Each name landed like a stone in still water. James's jaw tightened. "This is unseemly talk for a woman of your station." "My station?" Margaret laughed, a sound like breaking crystal. "My father gave you this plantation as my dowry, James. My mother's silver fills this house. My name, Hale, opened every door your war medals couldn't. And you've spent 15 years of our marriage taking advantage of women who have no choice in the matter." "Their property, Margaret. You're being hysterical." The hairbrush hit the mirror with such force that both shattered. Margaret stood, glass glittering in her hair like a crown of ice. Her hands didn't shake, her voice didn't rise. "I am not hysterical," she said. "I am clear-headed for the first time since I was 17 and foolish enough to believe a man's promises. Do you know what they call me in town? Poor Margaret. St. Margaret, so patient with the Colonel's appetites. Dean, as if I'm noble for enduring your degradation." James stepped forward, his voice dropping to the register he used with frightened horses. "Lower your voice. The servants will hear what I want them to hear." Margaret turned to the bell pull and yanked it 3 times. "Because tonight, James, you're going to understand what it means to be helpless. What it means to face consequences." The color drained from his face. "What are you talking about?" Footsteps sounded in the hallway. Quick, fearful, the door opened and Tobias appeared, the house manager, 50 years old, with iron-grey hair and hands scarred from decades of labor. Behind him stood 2 younger men, Moses, 23, tall and muscular from fieldwork, and Samuel, 19, with artist's fingers and a scholar's eyes that had learned to read despite the laws forbidding it. All 3 had been born on this plantation. All three had watched their mothers, sisters, daughters disappear into the big house at the Colonel's summons. "You called, Miss Margaret?" Tobias's voice was carefully neutral, but his eyes moved between husband and wife, calculating danger. "Yes." Margaret's smile was terrible in its serenity. "The Colonel and I are having a discussion about property, about ownership, about what belongs to whom." She looked at James. "These three men, Tobias, Moses, Samuel, they're yours, aren't they? Your property, your possessions to do with as you please. Margaret, stop this. Answer me." James's hand moved toward the door, but Margaret's gaze followed the movement, and her smile sharpened. "You won't leave, not with witnesses, not with your reputation to consider, not when Nathaniel Hale, my brother the judge, arrives tomorrow for supper." The threat hung in the air. James's hand fell. "They're mine," he said quietly. "According to law." "According to law," Margaret nodded. "And I am yours, according to law. Your property, your possession. Isn't that what marriage is, James? A transfer of ownership from father to husband?" She walked to her husband, so close he could smell the rosewater in her hair. "But tonight, you're going to learn what it feels like to be powerless, to witness consequences you cannot control." She turned to the three men. Their faces were masks of careful nothing, the survival skill of those who lived in a world where the wrong expression could mean punishment or worse. "Tonight," Margaret said clearly, "the Colonel will have his supper at 8. Afterward, he will come to my chambers, and you three will come as well at my summons." "Miss Margaret," Tobias began, fear cracking through his neutrality. "You will not be harmed," she said. "You have my word, for whatever a white woman's word is worth to you." "Notidish." The room seemed to hold its breath. Samuel's eyes widened. Moses's hands clenched into fists. Tobias looked like he might be sick. James found his voice, rough as gravel. "You've lost your mind." "Perhaps." Margaret moved to her bed and sat upon it, arranging her skirts like a queen on a throne. "Or perhaps I've found it. You've made me watch for 15 years, James. Every time you came to my bed, every time I saw your children in faces that weren't mine. Every time I held my silence and my dignity while you debased both." She leaned forward. "Tonight, you face what you've done. Tonight, you hear the truth from the people you've wronged, and you will listen." "I'll have you committed," James whispered. "I'll tell them you've gone mad." "You could try." Margaret's voice was almost kind. "But my brother the judge would need evidence." "And who would testify?" "These men, who would face consequences if they speak against me. The women you violated, who would be sold south if they open their mouths. Or perhaps you'll explain to the county why your wife insisted on a confrontation." The trap closed around him like iron jaws. If he refused, she'd spread the tale. A husband so weak he couldn't control his wife. If he reported her, the scandal would destroy them both, and the Hale family would side with Margaret. If he tried to stop her by force, there would be witnesses. "This is madness," he repeated, but his voice had no strength left. "No," Margaret said softly. "This is accountability. Imperfect, twisted accountability, but accountability nonetheless." She looked at the three men, and something flickered in her cold eyes. Was it pity? Rage? Both? "You're dismissed. Return at midnight. Tobias, you'll keep the house staff away from this wing. Tell them the Colonel and I are having a private discussion." The word dripped with venom. The three men left quickly, quietly, their backs rigid with terror. When the door closed, Margaret and James stood in silence, the afternoon sun slanting through windows that suddenly felt like prison bars. "Why?" James asked finally. "Why this?" Margaret walked to the window again, looked out at the fields where women bent and children played and men sang songs of sorrow and endurance. "Because you took everything from me," she said. "My youth, my dignity, my ability to bear children. Did you think I didn't know? That fever I had our second year of marriage, the one you barely noticed?" Her voice cracked just slightly. The doctor told me then I would never conceive, and you just kept creating children everywhere, with everyone, as if to mock me." She pressed her palm against the glass. "So tonight, I confront you with truth, with witnesses, with the reality of what you've done." She turned, and tears finally tracked down her face, but her voice remained steady. "And maybe, just maybe, those 3 men will understand that I see them, that I know what you've done, that someone somewhere in this cursed house bears witness to their suffering." "They'll still suffer," James said bitterly. "After tonight, when this madness ends, they'll face consequences for what you've made them witness." Margaret smiled through her tears. "Will they? How will you explain it, James? What story will you tell?" She had thought of everything, planned for everything, and James Wainwright, for the first time in his life, felt the ground disappear beneath his feet. He left the room without another word, his footsteps echoing down the hall like a death march. Margaret waited until she heard his study door slam. Then she sank to the floor, her silk dress pooling around her like spilled blood. Her hands shook now. Her breath came in gasps, but when she looked up at her reflection in the broken mirror, her face fractured into a dozen jagged pieces, she saw something she hadn't seen in years. Purpose. Outside, the afternoon faded toward evening. The enslaved people finished their work and returned to their quarters, where whispers spread like wildfire. Something was happening in the big house. Something terrible. They'd seen the look on Tobias's face, the fear in Moses's eyes, the way Samuel had walked like a man to his execution. And in the kitchen house, Sarah held her son Joshua close and prayed to a God she wasn't sure listened anymore, because whatever was coming, whatever Margaret Hale Wainwright had planned in her cold fury and broken grief, would change everything. The South ran on secrets, on silences, on the unspoken understanding that some sins were simply the price of civilization. But Margaret had decided she would no longer pay that price quietly. If she was damned, she would drag others down with her. If she was broken, she would break back. And if justice was impossible in this world of laws written by men like her husband, then she would create her own confrontation, twisted and terrible as it might be. The clock in the hallway chimed 6 times, 6 hours until midnight. 6 hours until Hawthorn Manor became a stage for something that would be whispered about for generations. Never fully spoken, never fully understood. 6 hours until 3 families began their slow, inexorable march toward ruin. Margaret rose from the floor, smoothed her dress, and began preparing for the longest night of her life. The kitchen house sat apart from the main building, connected by a covered walkway that the house slaves used to bring food to the dining room. Inside, the air was thick with heat from the cooking fire and the smell of roasting meat. Sarah worked at the preparation table, her hands moving automatically through the familiar motions of cutting vegetables, but her mind was elsewhere. Joshua sat in the corner, playing with carved wooden animals his father had made before he'd been sold to a plantation in Louisiana. The boy was 8, and he had James Wainwright's aristocratic nose, his high forehead, his way of tilting his head when he was thinking. Sarah tried not to look at him too often. Every glance was a reminder of a night 5 years ago, when the Colonel had sent for her, when she'd had no choice, when she'd prayed the whole time that it would be quick. "Mama?" Joshua looked up. Why did Mr. Tobias look scared? Sarah's knife paused mid-cut. "Hush now, that's not our concern." But it was. Everyone in the quarters knew it was. The house slaves had a sense for when trouble was brewing, an instinct honed by generations of survival, and tonight the very air seemed to crackle with it. The door opened and Delilah entered, carrying a basket of roses from the garden. She was 40, though she looked older, worn down by decades of labor and sorrow. Her daughter Lily, 14, followed behind, silent as always. Lily had learned early not to be noticed. She had James Wainwright's eyes, that particular shade of grey-blue that marked her as undeniably his, and Sarah had watched the girl learn to look down, to become invisible, to pray that the Colonel wouldn't notice her the way he'd noticed her mother. "The big house is quiet," Delilah said, setting down her basket. "Too quiet. Miss Margaret sent everyone away from the East Wing, told them to stay in their quarters after supper." Sarah felt her stomach tighten. Why? Don't know. But Tobias came to the field this afternoon, pulled Moses and Samuel away from their work. They looked... She trailed off, searching for the word. Terrified. The three women exchanged glances. In the language of the enslaved, terror meant danger, and danger meant someone was going to suffer. The only question was who. "My Samuel," Delilah whispered. Her son was 19, bright and beautiful, with hands that could coax music from nothing, and a mind that absorbed knowledge like earth absorbed rain. James Wainwright had noticed his intelligence and used him sometimes for errands that required reading or calculation, a dangerous distinction that set Samuel apart from other field slaves. "If something happens to him, nothing's going to happen." Sarah's voice was firm, though she didn't believe her own words. "We keep our heads down. We do our work. We survive, like always. But survival had a cost, and they all knew it. Sarah's cost had been Joshua, conceived in violation and born into bondage. Delilah's cost had been Lily, growing up beautiful and vulnerable in a house where the master took what he wanted. And Ruth's cost, young, pregnant Ruth, who worked in the rose garden, was currently growing in her belly. As if summoned by thought, Ruth appeared in the doorway. She was 18, barely more than a girl, with skin like polished mahogany and eyes that had learned to hide everything. Her pregnancy was 4 months along, just starting to show beneath her work dress. "Miss Margaret wants supper served early," Ruth said quietly. 7 o'clock instead of 8. Just for her and the Colonel. No one else. Early. Sarah frowned. The Wainwrights always dined at 8 precisely. It was one of Margaret's ironclad rules, part of the rigid structure that governed life at Hawthorn Manor. That's what she said. Ruth moved to help with the cooking, her movements careful. And she said the Colonel looked like a condemned man. The words hung in the air, ominous and strange. Sarah felt something cold slither down her spine. In the corner, Joshua had stopped playing with his toys and was watching the women with wide eyes that understood more than a child should. "Go find your friends," Sarah told him. "Play outside before dark." Joshua obeyed, grateful to escape the tension that filled the kitchen house. When he was gone, the 4 women looked at each other. "Something's broken," Delilah said finally. In the big house between them, they all knew what she meant. For 15 years, James and Margaret Wainwright had maintained the fiction of a proper marriage. They attended church together, hosted parties, appeared in public with practiced smiles. But everyone who lived at Hawthorn Manor knew the truth beneath the veneer. They'd seen Margaret's face after the Colonel returned from his nighttime visits to the quarters. They'd watched her grow thinner, colder, more brittle with each passing year. "Broken things are dangerous," Sarah murmured. "They cut when you touch them." "Or they cut back," Ruth said, so quietly the others almost missed it. They all turned to look at her. Ruth kept her eyes on the vegetables she was chopping, but her jaw was set in a way that reminded Sarah of her own mother, a woman who'd been sold south for the crime of speaking back to an overseer. "You think Miss Margaret is fighting back?" Delilah asked. Ruth's hand paused. I think if I was her, watching for 15 years, knowing what I know." She looked up then, and there was something fierce in her gaze. "I think I'd want him to face consequences, one way or another." The truth of it settled over them like a shroud. They'd all seen Margaret watching from windows. They'd all caught her gaze lingering on children who looked like her husband. They'd all wondered how she bore it, this daily humiliation, this public knowledge of her husband's behavior. Now, perhaps, they were about to find out. "Whatever happens tonight," Sarah said firmly, "we know nothing. We saw nothing. We heard nothing. You understand?" The others nodded. It was the first rule of survival. Ignorance was armor. Knowledge was a death sentence. They finished preparing supper in silence: roasted duck with cherry sauce, candied yams, fresh bread, pecan pie, food fit for aristocracy, prepared by hands that would never taste such abundance. When everything was ready, Sarah and Ruth carried the trays through the covered walkway to the main house. The east wing was indeed empty. Usually house slaves would be everywhere at this hour, lighting lamps, turning down beds, attending to 100 small tasks. But tonight the hallways were deserted, and their footsteps echoed on the hardwood floors. They found the colonel in his study, sitting in his leather chair with a crystal glass of whiskey in his hand. He'd already been drinking. Sarah could smell it, could see it in the slight looseness of his posture. But his eyes were clear and fixed on nothing, staring into some middle distance that she couldn't see. He didn't look at them as they set out his food, didn't acknowledge their presence at all. Sarah had served him for 10 years, and she'd never seen him like this, diminished somehow, as if something essential had been drained out of him. "Colonel," she ventured carefully, "your supper, sir." He blinked slowly, then focused on her face. For a moment, just a moment, something flickered in his expression. Was it shame, regret? But then it was gone, replaced by the cold authority she knew so well. "Leave it," he said. His voice was hoarse. "Get out." They fled. When they reached Margaret's chambers, they found her seated at her vanity, perfectly composed. She'd changed into a different dress, deep burgundy silk that made her pale skin look almost luminous. Her hair was down, cascading over her shoulders in auburn waves. She looked like a portrait of beauty, but her eyes were dead. "Set the table by the window," Margaret instructed. "The colonel will join me here for supper." Sarah's hands trembled as she arranged the place settings. This was wrong. Married couples of their station always dined in the formal dining room. To eat in the bedroom was intimate or invasive. She wasn't sure which. "Will you need anything else, Miss Margaret?" Ruth asked. Margaret turned, and for the first time in years, she really looked at Ruth, not past her, not through her, but at her. Her gaze dropped to Ruth's belly, lingered there, then rose again to Ruth's face. "How old are you?" Margaret asked softly. 18, ma'am. "And the father?" Ruth's breath caught. It was a question no one was supposed to ask, though everyone knew the answer. "Ma'am, The truth, girl. You won't be punished for it." "The colonel, ma'am." Ruth's voice was barely a whisper. "He sent for me in June. I had no choice." Something terrible moved across Margaret's face. A spasm of pain so intense it looked physical. She closed her eyes, breathed deeply, then opened them again. "No," she said quietly. "You had no choice. None of you ever do." She stood, moved toward Ruth, and did something incomprehensible. She reached out and gently touched Ruth's face. "I see you," Margaret whispered. "I want you to know that. I see what he's done, what he continues to do, and tonight I'm going to make him see it too." Ruth didn't understand, but unease bloomed in her chest anyway. "Miss Margaret, please, whatever you're planning, go." Margaret's hand dropped. "Both of you. And if you value the lives of those you love, you'll forget this conversation ever happened." They went. They had no choice. As they hurried back through the darkening hallways, Ruth's hands shook. "She's going to confront him," Ruth whispered. "Whatever she's planning, it's going to change everything." Sarah wanted to argue, but she couldn't, because deep in her bones, she knew Ruth was right. Margaret Hale Wainwright had spent 15 years watching her world crumble piece by piece, and tonight, she was going to force a reckoning. They reached the kitchen house just as full dark settled over Hawthorn Manor. In the quarters beyond, enslaved people were finishing their meager suppers and preparing for sleep. They didn't know that 3 of their number, Tobias, Moses, Samuel, sat in Tobias's cabin, staring at each other with the eyes of condemned men. "We could run," Moses said. He was 23, strong enough to try. Take our chances in the swamps. They'd hunt us down, Tobias replied. He was 50 and had seen too many runaways caught, too many punishments, and even if we made it north, our families would pay the price. Samuel, the youngest, sat with his head in his hands. What does she want from us? His voice was anguished. Why is she doing this? None of them had answers. They only knew that at midnight they were expected at Margaret Wainwright's chambers, where the colonel would be waiting, where something unspeakable was going to happen. It's a confrontation, Tobias said finally, or revenge, or madness, maybe all three. Whatever it is, Moses said, his voice hard, we're the ones who will face consequences for it. White woman accuses, black men suffer. That's how it works. They all knew he was right. Whatever Margaret had planned, whatever happened tonight, they would be blamed. They were always blamed. The law was clear. Their testimony meant nothing. Their bodies were property. Their lives were expendable. Maybe, Samuel looked up, his scholar's mind trying to find a way through the impossible. Maybe she wants witnesses. She said we wouldn't be harmed. What if she just wants us to see, to bear witness to whatever she's going to say to him? That's almost worse, Tobias said quietly, because then we'll carry it forever and we'll never be able to speak of it. The clock in the big house began to chime. They counted silently, 7 times, 5 hours until midnight, 5 hours until their lives changed forever. In the big house, James Wainwright climbed the stairs to his wife's chambers like a man ascending a gallows. He knocked on the door, heard her voice, calm and musical. "Come in, husband." He entered, and the trap closed behind him. The colonel stood in his wife's chambers like a stranger in a foreign land. He'd been in this room countless times over 15 years of marriage, but tonight it felt different. The furniture seemed to crowd closer, the shadows stretched longer, and the candlelight flickered with an unsettling rhythm that made everything appear to move. Margaret sat at the small table by the window, her burgundy dress glowing in the warm light. The food remained untouched between 2 place settings. She gestured to the chair across from her. "Sit, James. We should eat." "I'm not hungry." His voice came out rougher than intended. The whiskey hadn't helped. It had only made the edges of reality softer, more dreamlike, which somehow made everything worse. "Sit anyway." It wasn't a request. He sat. Margaret began to serve herself small portions of food. Her movements were graceful, practiced, the perfect hostess, even in this perverse parody of a dinner party. "Do you remember our wedding night?" she asked conversationally, cutting into her duck. "You were so gentle, so patient. I thought—" She paused, knife suspended in midair. "I thought I was the luckiest woman in Mississippi, a war hero who looked at me like I was something precious, a man who promised me the world. Margaret, I'm not finished." Her eyes lifted to his, and they were empty as winter lakes. 3 months after the wedding, you came to my bed smelling of perfume that wasn't mine. I told myself I was imagining things. 6 months later, I saw you watching that girl from New Orleans, the one with the flower cart, and I knew. But I told myself it was just men's nature, that I should be patient, understanding. She took a small bite, chewed carefully, swallowed. James found he couldn't look away from her face, couldn't move. Then came the fever. Her voice dropped. That awful fever that nearly killed me. You stayed away the entire 2 weeks. Do you know why I survived? Because Sarah, that woman whose son has your face, she sat with me every night, bathed my forehead, held my hand, and while I was delirious, burning up with infection, she whispered to me, told me things she thought I wouldn't remember. James felt something cold slither through his chest. What things? That you'd been with her, that she'd had no choice, that her baby boy was yours, and she prayed every day that you wouldn't notice, wouldn't claim him, wouldn't use that knowledge against her. Margaret set down her fork with exquisite precision. She thought she was confessing to a dying woman. But I lived, James. I lived, and I remembered everything. The clock in the hallway ticked steadily. Outside, the September night insects sang their chorus. Inside Margaret's chambers, the silence between husband and wife grew teeth. "That was 15 years ago," James said finally. "You've known for 15 years and said nothing? What should I have said?" Margaret's laugh was brittle. "Should I have complained to my father, who would have told me that men have needs? Should I have gone to the church, where the pastor keeps his own enslaved mistress? Should I have told my friends so they could whisper poor Margaret with more certainty?" She leaned forward. "I had no power, James, no voice, no recourse. Just silence and endurance, the twin virtues of Southern womanhood. So this is revenge." He gestured at the room, at the untouched food, at the madness of the situation. "This elaborate confrontation, this is truth-telling." Margaret stood, moved to the window. Outside, the darkness was complete, broken only by the dim lights from the slave quarters. "Tonight, you're going to hear what you've done. From the people you've wronged, and you will listen. By forcing me to face—" He couldn't finish the sentence. The words choked him. "Yes." She turned back to him. "They're going to tell you what you've done to their families, what you continue to do, and you're going to sit there and hear every word. This won't fix anything, won't undo what's been done." "No." She moved closer to him, close enough that he could see the tears gathering in her eyes. "But it will mean something. It will mean that for one night, one single night, the truth was spoken aloud, that the powerful heard from the powerless. It will mean that I didn't just accept my fate, that I fought back, even if the fight is ugly and cruel." James looked at his wife, truly looked at her, and saw the woman he'd married buried somewhere beneath layers of hurt and rage and years of swallowed silence. Something in him wanted to reach for her, to apologize, to try to salvage what remained of their life together. But it was too late. Had been too late since that first night he'd sent for Sarah, since the first time he'd used his power to take what should only be given freely. The seeds of this disaster had been planted years ago, and now they were simply watching the poisonous harvest come in. "If I refuse," he asked quietly, "if I just walk out that door, then I tell everyone." Margaret's voice steadied. "I tell your fellow officers, the governor, my brother the judge. I describe in exact detail every violation, every child, every woman. I become a scandal so great that even this society can't ignore it. You'll be ruined socially, perhaps legally." The trap was perfect. Stay and endure humiliation, or leave and face complete destruction. James had built his whole life on control. Control of his plantation, his slaves, his reputation, his world. And his wife had found the one crack in that control and driven a wedge through it. "Why them?" he asked. "Tobias, Moses, Samuel. Why those three specifically?" Margaret's expression softened into something that might have been pity. "Because Tobias's daughter Ruth is carrying your child right now. Because Moses' sister Delilah was your mistress for 3 years. Because Samuel's mother Sarah nursed me through that fever while pregnant with your son. They've all felt your power, James. All of them, and tonight you'll hear what it cost them." The clock began to chime. They both froze, counting. 8, 9, 10, 11, 12. Midnight, a knock at the door, soft and terrified. "Enter," Margaret called. The door opened slowly. Tobias came first, his grey hair catching the candlelight, his face carved from stone. Behind him, Moses moved with the cautious grace of a man expecting violence at any moment. And finally Samuel, whose scholar's eyes darted around the room, as if mapping exits, calculating odds of survival. All three stood just inside the doorway, their backs against the wall. Their terror was palpable, a living thing that filled the room like smoke. Margaret walked to them slowly. "Thank you for coming. As I told you earlier, you will not be harmed. You have my word, for whatever a white woman's word is worth to you." None of them responded. They'd learned long ago that silence was safest. "Colonel Wainwright," Margaret said formally, "these men are here to speak truth to you. about what you've done to their families, about the children you've created and abandoned, about the lives you've destroyed. She turned to the three men. You may speak freely. I will protect you from consequences to the best of my ability. The promise hung in the air, fragile as spun glass. All three men knew it could shatter at any moment. Tobias, as the eldest, spoke first. His voice was measured, careful, but underneath ran a current of decades of suppressed rage. Colonel, you sent for my daughter Ruth in June. She's 18 years old. She's carrying your child now. That makes her the fourth woman in my family line that you've claimed. My mother, my wife, who died giving birth to your child, my oldest daughter, now my youngest. James's face went grey. I didn't know. You didn't want to know. Tobias cut him off. Easier that way. Easier to tell yourself we're just property. That our family bonds don't matter. That our daughters are just available. Moses stepped forward, his fists clenched at his sides. My sister Delilah. For 3 years you kept her in the house, kept her away from the man she loved. She has your daughter, Lily. That girl is 14 now and she's terrified. Terrified that when she gets a little older, you'll notice her too. My sister cries every night, praying that you'll leave her child alone. The words landed like physical blows. James recoiled, his hands gripping the arms of his chair. Samuel, the youngest, spoke last. His voice trembled, but didn't break. My mother Sarah. I have your face, Colonel, your nose, your eyes. Every day of my life I've walked around carrying your features, and every day she's looked at me and seen her violation. She loves me, I know she does, but I also remind her of the worst night of her life. He stepped closer, and tears tracked down his face. I'm 19 years old. I can read. I can write. I can calculate figures in my head, and none of it matters because I'm your son, and you've never acknowledged me, never protected me, never even looked at me like I'm human. His voice rose slightly. Do you know what that does to a person? To know your own father sees you as property. The room fell silent. Margaret stood to the side, watching her husband's face crumble as the full weight of his actions finally penetrated his armor of privilege and denial. James tried to speak several times, his mouth opening and closing soundlessly. Finally he managed, I didn't think. I never meant. You never thought about it at all, Margaret said coldly. That was the problem. You took what you wanted and never considered the cost. Never thought about the children growing up enslaved to their own father. Never thought about the women who had no choice. Never thought about anything except your own desires. She moved to stand beside the three men, a gesture of solidarity that shocked them all. These men have spoken truth to you. What will you do with it? James looked at each of them in turn. Tobias, whose 4 generations of women he'd violated. Moses, whose sister still wept at night. Samuel, the son he'd never acknowledged. The weight of it all was crushing, suffocating. I don't know, he whispered. God help me, I don't know how to fix this. You can't fix it, Tobias said flatly. You can only stop doing it, and even that won't undo the harm. But it's a start, Margaret added. Acknowledge these men, acknowledge what you've done, and then decide what kind of man you want to be going forward. The confrontation stretched on for hours. The three men spoke of other violations, other women, other children. They spoke of beatings for imagined infractions, of families torn apart when members were sold, of the daily humiliations of slavery. And James listened. For perhaps the first time in his life, he truly listened to the voices of the people he'd considered property. As dawn approached, something fundamental had shifted in the room. I'll draw up manumission papers, James said finally, his voice hoarse from disuse and emotion, for the 3 of you, and money to help you start over in the north. That won't fix what's broken, Moses said. No, James agreed, but it's all I can offer, that and a promise to stop, to change, to try to be better than I've been. Margaret watched all of this unfold with mixed emotions. She'd wanted to hurt her husband, to humiliate him the way she'd been humiliated. But watching these three men bare their souls, watching them risk everything to speak truth to power, it had changed something in her too. "You may go," she told the three men, "and thank you for your courage tonight." They left quickly, silently, disappearing into the pre-dawn darkness. When they were gone, Margaret and James sat in the wreckage of their marriage. "What happens now?" James asked. "I don't know," Margaret admitted, "but I can't stay here, can't stay married to you. The papers tonight are a start, but they don't change what you did, what we both participated in. Where will you go?" "New Orleans. Start over. Try to live with what I've become." She looked at him. "And you?" "I'll stay. Face what I've done. Try to make what amends I can." He paused. "Though I suspect this night will be my undoing in other ways." He was right. Within weeks, the story spread, distorted, exaggerated, but based in truth. The confrontation at Hawthorn Manor. The three freed slaves, Margaret's departure, and the Colonel's apparent breakdown. 3 weeks after that terrible midnight confrontation, the whispers had spread through Natchez society like poison in the groundwater. The story changed with each telling. Some said Margaret had gone mad with jealousy. Others claimed the Colonel had suffered a nervous collapse. Still others whispered about a slave rebellion that had been barely contained. But everyone agreed on one thing. Something had broken at Hawthorn Manor, and the breaking was spreading. James Wainwright stood in his study, staring at the manumission papers he'd filed with Judge Nathaniel Hale. Margaret's brother had listened to the story with a face like carved stone, asked few questions, and signed the documents. But before James left, the judge had spoken quietly. "You've destroyed my sister's life, Wainwright. These papers don't balance those scales. Nothing does." The words echoed in James's mind as he poured another whiskey. It was barely noon, but he'd stopped caring about propriety weeks ago. The servants moved around him like ghosts, speaking only when necessary, their eyes carefully averted. They knew. They all knew. Tobias, Moses, and Samuel had left 3 days after the confrontation. James had provided the wagon, supplies, money, and letters of introduction to abolitionists in Cincinnati. He'd watched them roll away from Hawthorn Manor, carrying nothing but small bundles, and the trauma of what they'd witnessed and survived. Now the plantation ran on momentum and fear. The overseer managed the fields. The house staff performed their duties. But everyone felt the absence of those 3 men, felt the crack in the foundation that their departure represented. If the Colonel could free slaves out of guilt, what did that say about the entire system? If Margaret Hale Wainwright, descended from one of the oldest families in Mississippi, could abandon her position and flee, what did that mean for Southern society? The questions had no comfortable answers. A knock at the door interrupted his brooding. "Enter!" Sarah stepped inside, her face carefully composed. She'd avoided him since that night, sending other servants to attend to his needs. But today, she'd come herself. "Colonel, sir, there's a matter requiring your attention." "What matter?" "Ruth, the baby is coming early. She's not well, sir." James felt something cold grip his chest. Ruth, Tobias's daughter, 18 years old and carrying his child. He'd tried not to think about her since Tobias left, tried to push the guilt into a corner of his mind where it couldn't touch him. "Send for the doctor," he said roughly. "Already done, sir." "But—" Sarah hesitated. "Sir, she's asking for you." "Why would she ask for me?" Sarah's eyes met his for the first time in weeks, and in them he saw something that made him flinch. "Because you're the father, sir. And she's scared. And despite everything, part of her still hopes you might care." The words were a condemnation wrapped in simple truth. James followed Sarah to the quarters, something he rarely did. The slaves' living spaces were deliberately kept separate, out of sight, so the white family didn't have to confront the realities of their labor. Ruth's cabin was small, cramped, stifling in the September heat. She lay on a narrow bed, her skin slick with sweat, her face contorted in pain. Delilah and another woman attended her, but they stepped back when James entered. Ruth's eyes found his face, and something desperate flickered there. "Colonel?" He moved closer, awkward and uncertain. He'd never attended a birth, never been present for this most human of moments. "The doctor is coming. Too late." Ruth's voice was barely a whisper. "Baby's coming now. Something's wrong. I can feel it." And she was right. The birth was complicated, too early, too dangerous. The baby, a boy, was born blue and still, never drawing breath. Ruth hemorrhaged badly, the blood soaking through the bedding faster than the women could staunch it. James stood frozen, watching the life drain from this girl he'd used, this 18-year-old who'd had no choice, who'd never asked for any of this. Her eyes stayed on his face the whole time, as if seeking something. Forgiveness, acknowledgement, just recognition that she mattered. "I'm sorry," he whispered, but he wasn't sure she heard him before the light left her eyes. The silence in the cabin was absolute. Then Delilah turned to him, her face a mask of barely controlled fury. "Get out," she said quietly. "You've taken enough. Don't stand there and make her death about your guilt." He went, stumbled out into the afternoon sun, his hands shaking, his mind reeling. Ruth dead. The baby dead. 2 more lives destroyed by his actions, by the system he perpetuated, by the casual cruelty he'd thought was his right. The doctor arrived an hour later, but there was nothing to do except sign the death certificate. "Complications of childbirth," he wrote, the euphemism hiding the real cause: a girl too young, a baby conceived in violation, a system that ground human beings into dust. James paid for the burial in the plantation cemetery, a small gesture that meant nothing. He stood at the grave as Ruth and her unnamed son were lowered into the ground, watching the faces of the enslaved people who'd come to mourn. Their eyes accused him. Rightly so. That night, alone in his study, James finally understood the full weight of what Margaret had tried to make him see. It wasn't just about violated women or abandoned children. It was about the casual destruction of human lives, the way the system turned people into commodities, the way power corrupted everything it touched. He'd thought he could fix things with manumission papers and money, but Ruth's death proved how hollow those gestures were. 3 freed slaves meant nothing when dozens more remained in bondage, when young women still died bearing children they hadn't chosen to conceive, when the entire structure of society was built on suffering. For the first time in his life, Colonel James Wainwright felt the full horror of what he was. Not a war hero, not a pillar of society, just a man who'd used his power to destroy lives, who'd hidden behind law and custom to avoid facing his own monstrosity. The realization didn't redeem him, didn't fix anything, but it changed something fundamental. He began drawing up papers to free all his slaves, not immediately, which would create suspicion and danger, but gradually, over the next year. He began writing letters to abolitionists, asking how he could help. He began trying to dismantle the empire he'd built on suffering, but it was too late for Ruth. Too late for the dozens of children who bore his features and his name, but not his acknowledgement. Too late to undo 15 years of violation and cruelty. Some sins, he realized, couldn't be forgiven. They could only be witnessed, acknowledged, and carried forward as a reminder of what happened when people became property and power became righteousness. Meanwhile, in New Orleans, Margaret received word of Ruth's death through a letter from her brother. She sat in her small boarding house room, staring at the words, feeling the weight of her own complicity. She'd confronted James, yes. She'd forced him to hear truth, yes. But she'd also used those 3 men as instruments of her revenge, had terrorized them for her own purposes. Ruth's death was a reminder that the system destroyed everyone, victim and perpetrator and bystander alike. Margaret had thought she could fight it from within, could force accountability through confrontation. But the machine just kept grinding, crushing new victims, spilling new blood. She wrote back to her brother, asking him to sell her portion of the plantation. Whatever money came from it, she wanted donated to abolitionist causes. It wouldn't fix anything, but it was all she had to offer. The weeks turned to months. Hawthorn Manor continued to function, but something vital had died there that September night. The slaves felt it, moving through their daily routines with the knowledge that change was possible but not guaranteed. The white society felt it, whispering about the Wainwrights and avoiding Hawthorn Manor as if moral corruption might be contagious. James continued his slow process of manumission, freeing families in small groups, providing money and letters, sending them north. It was dangerous work. Other plantation owners watched suspiciously, muttering about setting bad precedents. But he persisted, driven by guilt and grief and the ghost of Ruth's desperate eyes. By the time winter arrived, Hawthorn Manor was operating with half its former enslaved population. The fields produced less, the house was quieter, and James Wainwright was a shadow of his former self, thin, haunted, aged beyond his years. One December evening he sat in Margaret's old chambers, the room where the confrontation had happened, where everything had begun to unravel. The furniture was still arranged the same way. The broken mirror still hung on the wall, never repaired. He looked at his fractured reflection and saw what he'd become. A man who'd finally faced his own monstrosity and found no redemption waiting, only the long work of trying to do less harm. It wasn't heroism. It wasn't even really justice. It was just survival, his own and that of the people he'd wronged. Each freed family was a small weight lifted, a tiny crack in the edifice of slavery. Not enough to bring the whole structure down, but enough to prove it could be damaged. As he sat there in the darkness, James heard something, or thought he heard it. A voice, faint and accusatory. Now you see. Margaret's voice from that terrible night. Or Ruth's voice from her deathbed, or perhaps just his own conscience, finally awake after decades of sleep. Yes, he whispered to the empty room. Now I see. But seeing didn't change what he'd done, didn't bring Ruth back, didn't undo the trauma of 3 men forced to witness something they should never have seen, didn't erase the children growing up enslaved to their own father. It just meant he'd carry the knowledge forward, live with it, let it wait his remaining years with the understanding that some debts can never be repaid, some harms never healed. Outside, the December wind blew cold across the fields. In the quarters, families prepared for winter, some making plans to leave when spring came and their manumission papers were ready. In New Orleans, Margaret woke from dreams of fire and blood. And in Cincinnati, 3 freed men tried to build new lives while carrying the weight of what they'd survived. The story of Hawthorn Manor had no clean ending, no redemption arc, no satisfying resolution, just people trying to live with what they'd done and what had been done to them. Just the slow, painful process of acknowledging harm and trying inadequately to do better. The South would continue for another 15 years before the Civil War finally tore it apart. Hawthorn Manor would eventually be sold, divided, forgotten. But the scars would remain, carried forward in descendants who inherited trauma, in stories whispered across generations, in the long shadow cast by systems built on human suffering. And sometimes, on quiet December nights, people passing by the land where Hawthorn Manor once stood would hear something on the wind. A voice, distant and accusatory, speaking words they couldn't quite make out. Those who knew the story would shiver and hurry past, because they understood what the wind was saying. Now you see, and they did see, the cost of slavery, the poison of power unchecked, the way violence echoes through time. They saw, and the seeing changed nothing, fixed nothing, redeemed nothing, but at least it was witnessed, at least it was spoken aloud. At least someone somewhere bore testimony to what happened when people became property and power became righteousness. That was all Margaret had wanted, for someone to see, for someone to acknowledge, for the silence to finally break, and it had broken imperfectly, destructively, but irrevocably. The truth, once spoken, could never be fully silenced again. Spring came to what remained of Hawthorn Manor like a hesitant promise. The cotton fields, now worked by half the enslaved population they'd once held, showed green shoots pushing through dark soil. But the vitality felt hollow, mechanical, life continuing out of habit rather than purpose. James Wainwright stood at the same window where Margaret had stood 9 months earlier, watching the diminished workforce move through their planting routines. He'd lost 30 pounds since that September night. His clothes hung loose on his frame, and the silver in his hair had spread like frost, overtaking the dark completely. In his hand, he held a letter from Cincinnati. Tobias had written a brief note saying they'd arrived safely, found work, were beginning to build lives as free men. The letter was formal, careful, giving no details that might endanger them if it fell into the wrong hands. But at the bottom, in small script, Tobias had added, "We survived. That will have to be enough." James folded the letter carefully and placed it in his desk drawer, alongside the others he'd received from freed families. Small confirmations that his attempts at restitution had at least achieved something, however inadequate. A knock at the door interrupted his thoughts. "Come in." Sarah entered, and James felt the familiar stab of guilt that her presence always brought. She was 43 now, and her son Joshua, his son, was 9. The boy was learning to read in secret just as Samuel had, carrying on a dangerous tradition. "Sir, Judge Hale is here to see you." James's stomach tightened. Nathaniel Hale's visits were never social. "Show him in." The judge entered with his characteristic formal bearing, tall, grey-haired, with eyes that missed nothing. He waited until Sarah left before speaking. "I've heard concerning reports, Wainwright. You've freed another 6 families this month. That brings the total to nearly 40 people in 8 months. I'm aware of the number. Other plantation owners are taking notice. They're saying you're destabilizing the system, setting a dangerous precedent." Nathaniel moved to the window, looked out at the fields. "There's talk of legislation to restrict manumissions. You're making powerful people nervous." "Good." The judge turned, studied James with those penetrating eyes. "You're destroying yourself. You know that, don't you? This guilt you're carrying, it's eating you alive." "Perhaps that's what I deserve." "Perhaps." Nathaniel's voice softened slightly. "But my sister is destroying herself too. She works 18 hours a day in that boarding house, barely eats, barely sleeps. She writes to me about donating her share of the plantation sale to abolitionist causes, but she won't take care of herself. Whatever happened that night, whatever you both did, it's killing you both." James said nothing. What could he say? That the confrontation had achieved exactly what Margaret had wanted. He understood now, saw clearly what he'd done, and the understanding was unbearable. "Ruth's death nearly broke her," Nathaniel continued. "She wrote me that she'd played with people's lives for her revenge, and an innocent girl had paid the price." "Ruth died because of me," James said flatly. "Not Margaret. I'm the one who violated her. I'm the one whose child she carried. Margaret just made me face what I'd done. And now you're both paying for it." The judge moved toward the door, paused. "I came to tell you that I'm recommending you cease the manumissions. Not forever, but slow down. You're drawing too much attention. If they pass restrictive legislation, it'll be harder to free anyone. And I should just let them remain enslaved in the meantime. You should be strategic. Free them gradually enough that it doesn't trigger a backlash that harms the broader abolitionist cause." Nathaniel's voice was firm. "You want to do good? Then do it smart. Don't let guilt drive you to actions that ultimately hurt more people than they help." The words were pragmatic, calculating, and probably correct. James nodded slowly. "I'll consider it." After the judge left, James sat alone with his thoughts. The irony wasn't lost on him. He'd spent 45 years believing in the rightness of slavery, in his own superiority, in the natural order that placed him above people like Sarah and Ruth and Tobias. Now he spent his days trying to dismantle that system, one manumission paper at a time. But the guilt was crushing. Every face he saw reminded him of what he'd done. Every child in the quarters might be his. Every woman had been vulnerable to his power. The weight of it all was suffocating. He began spending long hours in the slave cemetery, standing before Ruth's grave. The marker was simple wood, carved with her name and dates. Ruth Freeman, 1828-1846. He'd given her Tobias's chosen surname in death, a gesture that meant nothing but felt necessary. "I'm sorry," he would whisper to the ground. "I'm so sorry." But the dead don't forgive. They just stay dead, their lives cut short by decisions made by people with power over them. In New Orleans, Margaret was living out her own penance. She'd taken a job as a seamstress in a boarding house, work that destroyed her hands but kept her mind occupied. The other women who lived there knew her as Mrs. Hale, a widow of modest means who kept to herself. She attended a small church every Sunday, sitting in the back pew, saying the prayers by rote, but feeling no divine presence. How could God forgive what she'd done? She'd used 3 enslaved men as instruments of revenge, had terrorized them for her own purposes, had contributed to a system that had just killed Ruth. At night, she dreamed of that September evening, but in her dreams, she didn't stop. In her dreams, she went through with her terrible plan, and Samuel's traumatized face haunted her forever. She would wake gasping, drenched in sweat, grateful that at least she'd pulled back from the worst of it. But the relief was cold comfort. She'd still inflicted trauma, still used vulnerable people for her own ends, still participated in the machinery of slavery, even as she'd tried to rebel against it. One evening, she was sewing by candlelight when another boarder, a woman named Eliza, sat down beside her. "You carry such sadness, Mrs. Hale. I see it in your eyes." Margaret's hands paused in their work. "We all carry something, but yours feels heavier, like a weight that never lifts." Eliza leaned closer. "I've heard you at night, the crying, the nightmares. Whatever you've done, maybe talking about it would help." "I can't." Margaret's voice was barely audible. "I can't speak of it. To speak would be to relive it, and I barely survive it as it is." Eliza studied her face, then nodded. "Then I won't press, but know that whatever your sins, you're not alone in carrying them. We all have things we wish we could undo." The kindness was almost unbearable. Margaret had expected judgment, condemnation, the harsh righteousness of the church. Instead, she found simple human compassion from another woman who understood that life was complicated and people were flawed, and sometimes there were no good choices, only varying degrees of harm. "Thank you," Margaret whispered. That night, she wrote a letter to James for the first time since leaving Hawthorn Manor. It was short, carefully worded, but honest. "We both tried to fight a system too large for us. We both caused harm in the attempt. Ruth's death weighs on me as I'm sure it weighs on you. But we can't undo what's done. We can only try to do less harm going forward. Free them, James, all of them, before it's too late." She didn't sign it, but she knew he'd recognize her handwriting. James received the letter 2 weeks later. He read it 3 times, then placed it carefully in his drawer with Tobias's letter and the manumission records. Margaret was right. They couldn't undo what was done. But they could try to do better. He began the process of freeing the remaining enslaved people, careful to space it out, as Judge Hale had advised, but committed to completing it. Each family that left took a piece of his guilt with them, though the weight never fully lifted. By the summer of 1847, Hawthorn Manor had only a skeleton crew remaining, a few house servants who'd chosen to stay on as paid workers, and the field hands who were awaiting their turn for freedom. The plantation was dying, and everyone knew it. Other plantation owners whispered about James with a mixture of contempt and fear. He'd become a cautionary tale, What happened when you let guilt overcome good sense, when you questioned the natural order, when you listened to abolitionist sympathies? But James didn't care about their opinions anymore. He'd spent his whole life caring what powerful men thought of him, building his identity on their approval. Now he understood how hollow that foundation had been. One August evening, he sat in his study with the last batch of manumission papers. 23 people, the final group. Once he signed these, Hawthorn Manor would effectively cease to function as a plantation. The land would be sold, probably subdivided, turned to other purposes. His hand hesitated over the papers. This was the end of everything he'd built, everything he'd believed in. His father's legacy destroyed. His own reputation ruined. The Wainwright name forever associated with scandal and moral collapse. But then he thought of Ruth's desperate eyes, of Samuel's trembling voice saying, "You've never looked at me like I'm human," of Tobias's weary wisdom, "You can't fix what's broken, you can only stop doing it." James signed the papers. The following week, he made arrangements for the land to be sold. The proceeds would be divided, part to the freed families as restitution, part to abolitionist causes, a small portion kept back for his own modest needs. He would move to Natchez proper, live in a small house, fade into obscurity. On his last night at Hawthorn Manor, he walked through the empty rooms. The furniture was covered in sheets, the mirrors draped, the whole house feeling like a mausoleum. He ended up in Margaret's old chambers, standing in the spot where she'd confronted him nearly a year earlier. "I understand now," he said to the empty room. "I finally understand what you were trying to show me." The room offered no response, no forgiveness, no absolution, just silence. James left Hawthorn Manor at dawn, driving a small cart with his remaining possessions. He didn't look back. Behind him, the manor stood empty, its windows dark, its purpose ended. Within 6 months, the property would be sold to a merchant from New Orleans who would divide it into smaller parcels. The manor itself would stand empty for another year before being purchased by a family from Pennsylvania. They would live there for 3 years before inexplicable problems drove them away. Strange sounds, unexplained cold spots, a pervasive feeling of unease. The house would change hands 5 more times over the next decade, each owner staying only briefly before fleeing whatever haunted that place. Finally, in 1858, an accidental fire would burn it to the ground. Some said the blaze started in the east wing, in the room where Margaret had confronted James. Others claimed they saw a woman in the windows, standing still as the flames climbed the walls around her. By then, James was living in a modest boarding house in Natchez, working as a clerk for an attorney. He kept to himself, spoke little of his past, sent money regularly to freed families and abolitionist causes. He aged rapidly, his health declining, his body bending under the weight of what he carried. When news of the fire reached him, he felt an odd sense of relief. Let it burn, he thought. Let the whole cursed place turn to ash. In New Orleans, Margaret heard about the fire too. She sat in her small room staring at the letter and felt nothing. The house was just wood and stone. The real destruction had happened long before the flames. She continued her work, her penance, her quiet life of attempted atonement. She never remarried, never returned to Mississippi, never spoke publicly about what had happened at Hawthorn Manor. But sometimes, in the quiet moments before sleep, she would remember that September night, the look on Samuel's face, the trembling in Moses's voice, the ancient weariness in Tobias's eyes, and she would wonder if her confrontation had changed anything, or if she just added more trauma to an already traumatized world. The question had no answer. Or perhaps the answer was simply this: they'd all been trapped in a system so fundamentally broken that any attempt to resist it caused damage. The only choice was whether to resist imperfectly or comply silently. Margaret had chosen resistance, however flawed. James had eventually chosen recognition, however late, and 3 men had survived to build new lives, carrying the scars forward. It wasn't redemption. It wasn't justice. It was just survival. Messy, painful, incomplete survival. And sometimes that had to be enough. The years moved forward with the inexorable rhythm of time, grinding everything beneath their weight. By 1861, when the first shots of the Civil War echoed across Fort Sumter, the story of Hawthorn Manor had already faded into whispered legend. One more scandal among many in a region built on shameful secrets. James Wainwright died in 1860. At the age of 59, the doctor called it heart failure, but those who knew him understood it was something else, a spirit exhausted by the weight of acknowledged guilt. He was buried in a pauper's cemetery in Natchez, his grave marked only with a simple wooden cross. No family attended. No former colleagues came to pay respects. He died as he'd lived his final years, alone, forgotten, carrying sins that couldn't be absolved. But in his modest room, authorities found something unexpected: detailed journals spanning 13 years. Page after page of careful handwriting documenting every enslaved person he'd freed, every dollar he'd sent to abolitionist causes, every attempt at restitution. And interspersed with these practical records were confessions, raw, painful admissions of what he'd done to women who'd had no choice, children he'd abandoned, families he'd destroyed. The journals were passed to Judge Nathaniel Hale, who read them once and immediately locked them away. Some truths, he decided, were too dangerous to share. The South was tearing itself apart. These confessions would only add fuel to fires already raging. The journals would remain hidden for nearly a century, discovered only in the 1950s during an estate sale. By then, they'd become historical documents rather than personal confessions, evidence of one man's moral awakening in a society built on atrocity. Margaret outlived her husband by 26 years. She continued working as a seamstress, living simply, speaking to almost no one about her past. The Civil War reached New Orleans, bringing chaos and destruction, and finally, emancipation. She watched freed slaves celebrate in the streets and felt a complicated mixture of emotions: relief that the system had finally been destroyed, grief for all the lives ground up before its end, and guilt that she'd ever participated in it at all. In 1873, she fell ill with pneumonia. As she lay dying in her boarding house room, she asked for a priest. The young man who came listened to her confession for nearly 2 hours, emerging pale and shaken. He would later tell his superior that he'd heard the confession of a woman who'd tried to fight slavery by becoming cruel herself, who'd used the enslaved as weapons in her personal war, who'd spent nearly 3 decades trying to atone for one night of vindictive rage. "Did you absolve her?" the superior asked. "I don't know if I had the authority," the young priest replied. "Some sins are between a soul and God alone." Margaret died that night, alone except for one other boarder who sat with her. Her last words, barely audible, were, "Tell them I'm sorry. Tell them I saw. Tell them I tried to stop it." But there was no one to tell. The people she'd wronged were scattered across the country, building new lives, carrying forward their own scars. Her apology died with her, another voice lost in the cacophony of history. Tobias lived until 1901, dying at 95 in a small house in Cincinnati. He'd become a community elder, a grandfather, a man respected for his wisdom and quiet dignity. In his final years, his grandchildren would beg him for stories about slavery, about freedom, about the old days. He told them about the hard work, the close bonds between enslaved people, the small acts of resistance and survival. But he never mentioned Hawthorn Manor, never spoke of that September night when a white woman had forced him to stand in her bedroom and speak truth to power. Some stories, he believed, were too painful to pass down. Only on his deathbed, fevered and half delirious, did he finally speak of it. His daughter sat beside him, transcribing his rambling confession, not fully understanding what he described, but writing it down anyway. The document was tucked away in a family Bible, forgotten for decades. Moses had the shortest life of the three freed men. He worked on the railroad for 17 years, saving money, building a life. But the memories haunted him, his sister Delilah's tears, his niece Lily's frightened eyes, that terrible night in Margaret's chambers. He began drinking to quiet the ghosts. In 1863, he fell between two railroad cars during a coupling operation. Some witnesses said he'd been drinking. Others claimed he'd been clear-headed. A few who knew him well suspected that he'd simply stopped caring whether he lived or died, that the pain of memory had finally become unbearable. He was 39 years old. Samuel became a teacher, dedicating his life to educating freed slaves. He founded a small school in Cincinnati, taught hundreds of students, became known for his passionate belief in the power of education. But he never married, never formed close relationships, never let anyone truly know him. His students remembered him as brilliant but distant, as if part of him remained permanently elsewhere. On quiet evenings, he would sit alone in his small apartment and remember his mother Sarah, wonder if she'd survived the war, hope that Joshua, his half-brother, had found freedom and safety. Samuel died in 1882 at 46 from complications of tuberculosis. He left his school to a former student and his few possessions to charity. Among his papers, they found letters he'd written but never sent, to his mother, to Tobias, to Moses. Letters saying things he'd never been able to speak aloud. Sarah and Joshua survived the war and emancipation. They moved to Memphis, where Joshua used his education to become a clerk, then a bookkeeper, eventually a successful business owner. He married, had children, built a life, but he carried his father's face, and the knowledge of who his father was, and the complicated tangle of shame and resentment that came with being born from violation. He named his first son, Samuel, after the man who'd protected him once, and raised his children to understand that they carried a difficult history forward. His granddaughter would eventually write a book in the 1960s, during the civil rights movement, about a family torn apart by slavery. She'd interview elderly relatives, piece together fragments of the story, reconstruct what she could of those terrible days at Hawthorn Manor. The book would be published by a small press and would sell modestly, but it would preserve the story for future generations. Delilah and her daughter Lily survived as well, though their lives remained hard. Lily grew up beautiful and marked by her father's eyes, eventually marrying a freed slave from another plantation and moving to Arkansas. She bore children who carried James Wainwright's features forward through the generations, physical evidence of slavery's intimate violations. Delilah lived to be 73, dying in 1899. On her deathbed, she told her grandchildren, "Don't hate him. Don't hate any of them. Hate's too heavy to carry. Just remember what happened and make sure it never happens again." Oh, it was advice born from exhaustion and pragmatism. She'd spent her whole life carrying the weight of what had been done to her, and she didn't want her descendants burdened the same way. By the turn of the century, Hawthorn Manor was nothing but ruins. The burned foundations were slowly being reclaimed by vegetation, the fields reverting to forest, the whole place returning to the earth. Local children were warned to stay away, not because of any danger, but because the place had acquired a reputation for being haunted. People reported hearing voices on September nights, a woman's voice, calm but cruel, saying, "Now you see." The sound of men speaking, their words indistinct but their tone desperate. The weeping of someone young and frightened. Most dismissed these as imagination or the wind playing tricks. But a few understood that some places absorbed trauma, held it in the soil and stones, and released it back into the air when conditions were right. The descendants of those who'd lived through slavery scattered across America, carrying the story forward in fragments. Some knew they were related to James Wainwright, but kept it secret, unwilling to claim kinship with a man who'd enslaved their ancestors. Others spoke openly about their complicated lineage, using it as an example of slavery's intimate horrors. In the 1950s, when Tobias's deathbed confession was discovered, historians began trying to reconstruct what had happened at Hawthorn Manor. They found James's journals, Margaret's letters, property records showing the mass manumissions, newspaper articles about the scandal that had rocked Natchez society. But the full story remained elusive. What exactly had happened that September night? What had Margaret planned? How had it affected the three men who'd witnessed it? The historians could piece together facts, but not emotions. They could document events, but not trauma. The human cost remained forever beyond their reach, locked away in the hearts of people long dead. One historian wrote, "The Hawthorn Manor incident reveals the fundamental complexity of resistance to slavery. Margaret Wainwright sought to fight back against her own oppression, but used enslaved men as her weapons. James Wainwright eventually recognized his sins, but only after decades of harm. And the three freed slaves survived, but carried the scars forever. There are no heroes here, only people trapped in an evil system, trying desperately to survive or resist, and often harming others in the attempt." The article was published, cited in other works, became part of the academic record. But it couldn't capture the full truth. The terror in Samuel's eyes, the weight in Tobias's voice, the desperation in Ruth's final moments, the hollow grief in Margaret's decades of penance. Some things can't be captured in words or preserved in records. They can only be carried forward by the people who lived them, passed down through stories and silences, inherited like genetic memory. By the year 2000, the land where Hawthorn Manor once stood had been developed into suburban housing. Young families lived there, unaware of the history beneath their manicured lawns. Their children played in yards where enslaved people had once toiled, laughed in living rooms built where Sarah had wept, slept in bedrooms that stood where Ruth had died. The past was buried but not gone. Sometimes new homeowners would report odd occurrences, unexplained cold spots, strange sounds, a persistent feeling of sadness in certain rooms. Skeptics dismissed these as imagination. Others wondered if trauma could seep into the land itself, remain detectable decades or centuries later. The descendants of everyone involved still lived throughout America. Some knew their connection to Hawthorn Manor. Most didn't. But they all carried forward the complicated legacy of that September night, the courage and cruelty, the resistance and complicity, the survival and trauma that had defined that moment. And sometimes, when conditions were right, on September nights when the wind blew from the south and the moon was dark, people in that suburban neighborhood would hear something. A voice, faint but clear, speaking words that echoed across the centuries. "Now you see." It wasn't a haunting, not really. It was memory made manifest, history refusing to stay buried, the past insisting that it be witnessed, acknowledged, remembered. Because the story of Hawthorn Manor wasn't just about one plantation, one couple, three freed slaves. It was about America itself, the violence and violation that built the nation, the casual cruelty embedded in its foundations, the long shadow of slavery that still stretched across generations. Margaret had wanted James to see, to understand, to recognize the humanity of the people he'd treated as property, and eventually, reluctantly, he had. But the seeing had come too late to prevent harm, too late to save Ruth, too late to undo decades of violation. The question that haunted all their descendants was this: can you ever truly atone for sins committed in a fundamentally evil system? Or does participation in that system taint everything, making redemption impossible? There were no satisfying answers, just the long work of trying to do less harm. Just the painful process of acknowledging what had been done and carrying it forward honestly. Just the determination to ensure that future generations understood what their ancestors had survived and inflicted. The story ended not with resolution, but with memory. not with redemption, but with witness, not with justice, but with the stubborn insistence that what happened at Hawthorn Manor be remembered, spoken, passed down. "Now you see," the voice whispered across the years. "Now you understand. And maybe finally we do. We see how slavery poisoned everything it touched. We understand how people could be both victim and perpetrator. We recognize that resistance itself could be corrupted by the very system it opposed. We see that 3 families were ruined: the Wainwrights, who built an empire on violation and watched it crumble; the Hales, who enabled that empire through silence; and the descendants of the enslaved, who inherited trauma alongside their freedom. We see that Margaret's confrontation achieved something but fixed nothing, that James's repentance came too late to matter, that Tobias, Moses, and Samuel survived but never fully healed. We see all of it: the complexity, the tragedy, the moral ambiguity that defies simple narratives of heroes and villains. And in the seeing, perhaps we honor the memory of everyone who suffered through those terrible days. We acknowledge that they existed, that their pain mattered, that their stories deserve to be remembered even when the remembering is uncomfortable. The wind still blows across that suburban neighborhood. Children still play on land soaked with old suffering. And sometimes, for those who listen carefully, the voice still speaks, "Now you see," not as accusation or condemnation, but as invitation and challenge. See what was done. Understand what continues to echo. Remember what should never be forgotten. And perhaps in the seeing and understanding and remembering, find the strength to ensure that such evils never take root again. The story of Hawthorn Manor is finished, but its echoes continue, whispers passed down through generations, scars inherited alongside DNA, a complicated legacy that refuses to be simplified or sanitized. 3 families ruined, countless lives damaged. A system's evil made manifest in one September night of confrontation and consequence. Now you see.